Hey everyone, it's Kevin. I'm going to go over a little bit of system control and modifiers today. I know most of you wanted to see more about particle systems and complexity in that, but I think this will be useful before we jump into that, as you really need to have a good system for controlling and doing things with your project before we really get into controlling other things like cloners, particles, things like that. So let's get started. I made a little thing here. It's basically a few cloners that are kind of animating on their own with modifiers and effectors. And I just wanted to kind of illustrate using this, the idea of making very clear control. And this becomes really important when you work on a team or when you need to pass off project files to other people. So, if we just start to break down some of what I have here, you can start to pick apart the scene pretty easily. Basically, there's kind of 5 separate cloner systems that are behaving slightly differently. And basically, I have this here as the first cloner on the left, this as the second cloner, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. And right off the bat, we could jump in and start to exert control in some of these systems, like we could change the amount of glow, for instance, or, if you don't like the streaks, change that. And, when you're working alone and when you first start out, it's going to be really tempting to jump straight into the nodes that you want to control and just start controlling it directly. The big downside of this is when you hand this project file off to someone else, it's not immediately clear what sort of controls you've made. Like if I was walking into this project file, right, I would have to kind of pick through piece by piece and determine which controls are interesting and which ones are not. And for experimentation, that's fine. But when you're on a timeline and you need to get a project done and you've agreed upon certain controls, it can be really helpful to make those more obvious to someone else. So, without going too much into node graph organization, one thing that I think is really useful is commenting. If you don't know about comments, they're a node that you can add where you can basically type in some type of description or title for someone else to more easily pick through your project file. So based on what I told you guys earlier, I'm going to go ahead and label some of these cloner systems that I have for someone else to look through it and more easily understand what's going on. So even just giving it a simple number can be helpful. Right, so now someone who can go through it can more easily see, okay, so here are kind of the clear delineations of cloners. Another thing you can also do is you can group things, right? So if you select a bunch of nodes and hit Control G, you can make a group. This lets you send it to bin, relabel it, that sort of thing. For now, I'm not going to bother with it, but sometimes it can be convenient to group a certain complex system of nodes into a sort of module, you could say. Before we get too far here, I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of this layer and kind of show a before and after we go through and really do a bunch of stuff with it. So if I go to my timeline here, I can duplicate this layer. Let's name this first one with before, and the second one, with after. Okay, so for this after one, right, let's start with cloner system 1 here. And so if we go and look at this, right, it's a cloner system that is duplicating a bunch of spheres. And then we're using a turbulence effector to drive it. If you're not familiar with cloners and effectors, I wouldn't worry too much about that for now. I would say just focus on the idea that how we can make control more explicit to someone else. So let's say, we want the way that the size of these circles to change, to be able to be keyframed or exposed for later control. And that's the scale X parameter that I have here, right? So if I narrow this down, you can see the difference that happens is much smaller. And if I make them a lot larger, you can see that you get a much starker animation that's happening. For now, I can even disable these other systems, so just to draw focus to this. So, let's say we want to have some control of the scale X here, right? So if I wanted to, keyframe this, I could go in here, hit the K, and then start doing keyframes. But that doesn't really make sense because it's going to be hard for someone else to know, oh, okay, this is one of the variables that's keyframed. One technique that I find really useful is envelope modifiers. And in your modifier list, you can basically find it right, or where is it? Envelope modifier, right here. So envelope modifier is basically one of the few modifiers that you can have control of this value here. And as you change this value, it basically sends out this exact value to whatever you have down the chain. And most of these modifiers are intended to give you some type of control, like OSC modifiers, you can send OSC messages in, or math modifiers, you can have a certain function driving an animation. So because modifiers are so often used for control, I think it makes a lot of sense to use something in the modifier list to create your control handles, you could say, for your animation. So instead of controlling scale x here directly, let's feed in an envelope modifier for control. So a quick shortcut is you can drag this right onto the property and it'll go ahead and make that connection without you having to double click, hunt it down, drag it, connect it. So that's a really good tip there if you need to increase your speed. While I make this, we should also go ahead and add in comment. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this as effector scale, right? So right off the bat, you can see it's already walking into this file, right? It's a lot more clear what control the last user wanted us to have. Right away, you'll see, oh, here's an envelope modifier. The yellow is really bright. This is something that we could use to control the system. So, next, now that we know how we want to link up control, let's talk about scale, right? And how big these modifiers should get in terms of controlling different values. So to give you a better illustration of how much these scales can vary, right? For your turbulence here, if I disable this, a sensible value looks like it's somewhere from 0 to say, oh, I don't know, let's say 5, right? I wouldn't go much larger than 5 or much less than 0. So there are a couple ways that you can exert this control, right? By default, modifiers do an add function. So you could, for instance, make the scale like 0, and then in your envelope, make this value go up to 5. Similarly, you could also make this scale here something that goes up to 5. But you'll notice that it doesn't always have the intended effect you're looking for. And the larger issue that I have with it is all your modifiers are going to be different. It would be great if all of your control handles were the same, because to give you a better example, if I make another control for, say, my camera, so I'll do camera rotation heading. And the tricky part becomes, if you look at your camera here, if we want to animate the spin of this camera, for example, it becomes really tricky to match values because a sensible value for the rotation of your camera is up to 180 or greater. Whereas for other parameters, it may only go up to 1 or fractions of a number. So how do you keep this consistent? This is not necessarily the right way to do it, but the way that I prefer is changing this add operation to multiply. So by making this multiply, what that means is when this modifier is 0, it's going to multiply whatever it's controlling by 0. So if my control parameter here in my turbulence effector is, say, 2, a modifier value of 0 is going to bring that control way down. I've noticed that I probably have to add this to Y and Z here as well for a uniform scale. So you'll notice when my value in my envelope modifier is 0, nothing is happening. And when I increase this to 1, you get the expected value that you had before, right? So the reason multiply is so powerful is it allows you to set up your system and set up your sort of ceiling or maximums in the nodes where you exert this control. And that's really cool because you can create your system and then create control with envelope modifiers that are all identical. And there are a couple of reasons why I like doing this. I won't go into it too much, but the idea is that no matter what, the scale that you'll control goes from 0 to 1. And this helps just keep things consistent as you go through your scene and animate and expose parameters for D3. Just having a 0 to 1 scale tends to work best with a lot of the other systems that Notch ties into. So, for instance, if I also make this one multiply, I can now control our camera heading much more easily by giving it a maximum of 180 and then now being able to animate from 0 to 1 really handily. So, with this type of methodology, we can go through and make a couple more controls for our system, and I'll just go ahead and do that right now. For this next cloner, number 2 here, let's say we want some control of our sine axis scale y, basically how strong this sine wave is, or how the frequency of the sine wave, right? So I think that's a pretty interesting bit to control here. So let's say we set a maximum of 5. I think that looks pretty cool, and we'll make a copy of what we just had here, and we can give it a similar type of control. So using this multiply modifier, we can then manipulate the sine scale y of this. So as we change this value from 0 to 1, you can see we are now able to control the frequency of the sine wave on cloner number 2. So similarly, right, we could also add more of these labels to just help us understand which cloner systems these are controlling. So, labeling is really key as you go through and create controls for a system and animation parameters. So if we look at cloner system number 3, you'll notice I already have a math modifier here, which is kind of doing this saw animation. And, maybe as we look at this, we might want to be able to manipulate the speed of it, right? So similarly, let's make another control for speed. We'll set a maximum of, say, 1. That's pretty fast. And then I'll make a copy of this. And I'll call it speed. I just noticed I forgot to rename my comment up here. There you go. So in this math modifier, if we select that, we can go ahead and drag this envelope modifier right onto speed directly. And so now we have a really nice envelope modifier to control the speed of this thing. Oops, I did scale instead. I meant to do speed. There we go. So if we want it really slow, we do a value close to 0. If we want it to animate really quickly, we can increase this to 1, and it erases along there. Let's look at cloner system number 4. So with this sine effector, instead of changing our scale y this time around, let's look at some other parameter. Maybe this position x. This could be interesting. Right, control how wavy it is, or how the amplitude of the sine wave. So again, let's rename our comments. We'll call this amplitude x. So I just tied this envelope modifier to position x. Maybe I'll set a maximum value of, say, 1. And then now we have a nice control here of, how far out these squares wander as they animate. It actually looks kind of cool with 0 on it. And finally, cloner system number 5, right? I've got some semicircles that are spinning around here. And maybe I want some control of, let's say this noise scale, right? So a little more random pattern. And as this number gets lower, you get a pattern that's more consistent across all the semicircles. So again, let's make another copy. And you can start to see, you can spend quite a bit of time just exposing controls here, making it more obvious what's being controlled. And, there's, I think, a balance between spending too much time making your node graph tidy, organized for someone else. But, the more complex your node graph gets, the more time you're going to have to spend doing this in order to save time for your colleagues and also prevent them from getting frustrated with your messy node graph. So, just creating some controls and labeling them can make all the difference on a project that involves a really complicated node graph. What did I say? I was going to do noise scale here. There we go. So as this value is 0, they all spin the same way. And as this value goes to 1, they start to get more random. So we've got some nice controls here now for our cloner systems. And I try to, visually organize things the same way that my node graph is already laid out. So if I have cloners here that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I also try to lay out my controls like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, so that makes a lot of sense to me. Other controls here like our camera, we can certainly isolate in another area. That might make more sense. And then, we can start to look at some of our post effects here, for instance, like our glow, right? we can modify our intensity of this glow here. And same with the streaks, they kind of tie together nicely. So maybe I'll exert a control for glow and streaks together. And this is where envelope modifiers start to get really powerful, is you can control more than just one parameter. So for instance, if I weren't using this modifier system and we're animating nodes directly, I could go into this glow and animate intensity, but then I'd have to go and do the same thing for streaks in order for them to match up. And then if I make a change, I have to remember to do it to both, and that's just very prone to errors. So it's much simpler on yourself if you create a control parameter to control, say, just one parameter to begin with. And if you change your mind and decide you want it to exert the exact same identical control on another node, it's really easy just to make another link. So that's where it's really powerful. Similarly, if you say are animating this glow, right, it's giving you a nice amount of pop here, but then you decide that you actually, like, you've done all your keyframing, and you've spent a lot of time and work on that, and you decide, actually, no, I don't want it to control glow. Well, it's really easy to undo it then by disabling this control, disconnecting it. And, let's say you want it now to control something else. Instead of redoing all your keyframing or trying to copy keyframes between nodes, you can really easily just relink this to any parameter that you want to see that control on. So, as you start keyframing as well, like, modifiers give you a lot more flexibility in switching up what the control actually controls and how your system ends up looking. And it makes it much faster for you to test something, instead of not wanting to test something because it's going to be such a hurdle or effort to make that change. So similarly, let me go ahead and label this, and I'll call this glow/streaks. And similarly, instead of this number for the cloners, I could name it FX, for instance. And here I could make this cam for camera. So now we have some post effects controls that we can add up here, for instance. So we have, we have this invert. It's not active right now, but I could use this as a really powerful way on, say, LEDs or something to give it a little bit of pop. I'll make another copy of this and on this invert. Control the blend amount. So just remember that it's multiplied, so you need to set your maximums first before you start to do this. And by no means is this the right way. You may find a different way that you prefer, rather than multiplying the modifier, setting your scale, for instance, here, and just using add. But the important thing is that you abstract your control and your animation parameters from your system itself, because this allows you to rewire, delete, disable, whatever you want very obviously. And if I were to hand this file off to you, it's immediately clear that all these yellow nodes over here are my controls, right? So you don't have to then dive into the system and try to find, okay, where was that control for that look they wanted? Right away here, which controls they've already created for you. And it's really nice, even if you aren't handing this file to someone else, when you come back to a file sometime down the road, you may forget what you've done. And I've certainly had that problem, and this makes it much easier to kind of go back, dig through your file, immediately figure out which controls were interesting and which ones weren't. So, right here I'm doing inverts. So let me go ahead and label this. And now we could keyframe this effect, say, to do like a cool flash pop. I also have a digital chroma glitch that isn't active right now. So if I activate that, we get a little bit of glitchiness here. So I could also add a control for that. I'm going to call this glitch. Finally, I have a dot matrix effector that I thought was also pretty cool. Really turns it into this sparkling light LED sort of look. So I'll also add a control for that. Dot matrix. So at this point, I'd say we've got a pretty good handle on controlling our system, and I might offset these just to give it a bit of differentiation there. Oh, there's one more control I'd like to add, which is I'm using a color ramp effector to colorize these. If I disable that, there's what they are raw, and then here's with this color ramp that I've created, as well as so I'm basically using position Y to give these clones a color based on this gradient that I'm feeding in. And I think it'd be cool to have some control of that. So let's add one last one down here. And I'm going to keep the color control with these effects because I think that makes sense. I'll just call it color. The American spelling, haha. So I'll route this into, what do I want? I think source scale is what was interesting. So now as I increase this, right, I could have almost a sort of like equalizer color shift look. So if this is my maximum, I might want this red color to go a little higher. So now I can go into my color ramp and adjust that a little bit. Let's say other way, -1, still not quite enough, maybe -2. How about -10? It's still not quite tall enough. Let me move it up in Y a little bit. And then let's test our control, right? So there's 0. It's a little strong. Let me lower this ceiling a little bit. Still a little strong. Let's just say -1, maybe -2. There we go. I think that's pretty good. Right, as I tune this, this level can bump up, and that makes it really easy to animate this. So now we've added a bit of control in our system, right? And it makes it really easy for us to dive through and adjust our looks as we see fit. So by giving ourselves this element of control, we've made it much easier on ourselves to go through and basically make the changes that we want to make. So, you know, it's like I said, again, if we hand this off to someone, it's much easier for them to immediately look at this and get started with their work. So when you're working on a team, it can be really handy to agree upon a technique like this, whether you use it the exact same way that I've shown here or you decide on something else. Just, you know, make sure you can reach a consensus before you start any work, and it'll make your life much easier down the road. So, you know, if we go and look at our before and after, you'll see what a difference that makes. It's technically the same system, but without those parameters, you know, it'd take you quite some time to go through and figure out which things are actually interesting to control and in which way. And if I want to make any adjustments, you know, it becomes really slow and cumbersome to try to like find those things, especially if you're controlling 2 or 3 parameters at the same time. So that was before, this is after. And you can see what a difference that makes. Although it adds quite a few nodes to your node graph, it makes it much easier to go through the process of, say, exposing parameters, right? Or doing keyframing. And I wanted to dive a little bit into keyframe, but I think I'm going to leave that for another tutorial because it's getting pretty long. But hope that's helpful, and let me know if this is helpful or if it's not, or if anybody has suggestions too for how they work and can give tips. You know, that's always welcome. So until next time, thank you for watching and take care.